Welcome back, Whisky fans. We are back on Islay today, back on the South Shore. It's another Laphroaig. It's Laphroaig Law. Maybe it's just me, but I always kind of got the impression that Laphroaig want you to see this one as the replacement for the old 15. I don't think they ever actually stated it explicitly. Some people have suggested that this is a replacement for the old 18, which was discontinued a little bit before this was introduced. But to me, this dark green tube has really always given me sort of echoes of the old 15. The 18 was originally in a green tube as well, but that moved to the white. The 15 for a long time looked a lot like this. And it's always kind of made me think that they want this to be the 15's spiritual successor, or maybe even the successor to both, or at least that's what they want you to think. There is also the slight complication that John Campbell mentioned in a live stream the cask breakdown of this. I think it was about the time when it was first released. We're talking about the first batch. And what John actually told us was that Laphroaig Law is 65% 15-year-old first fill bourbon casks, with the remaining 35% being comprised of 21-year-old bourbon barrel matured whiskey, 10-year-old first fill Oloroso, which is specified as a full-term maturation, 11-year-old virgin European oak matured whiskey, 9-year-old quarter casks, which is also specified as a full-term maturation, and 8-year-old first fill bourbon. Interesting that they specify that the first fill Oloroso and the 9-year-old quarter casks are full-term maturation, but they don't say anything about the other components. But more important than that, this was verbal information which was specified at the time of the release of the very, very early batches of Laphroaig Law. So people will often quote this cask recipe, but what does it actually apply to? And that is the problem with verbal promises and verbal information about whiskey. If you're not going to put something on the label, all it tells us is that whatever you're saying applies to at least one bottle of one batch that was bottled at some time. It doesn't necessarily have any relevance to this bottle or your bottle or any other bottles. And that's the problem as well with getting a verbal information that a whiskey is natural colour and non-chill filtered. All that means is that at one point it is, and whiskey bottled before then may have not have been, and whiskey bottled today or tomorrow also may not be. So whiskey distilleries, if you want us to know something, put it on the label. Otherwise, probably don't bother. Speaking of being on the label though, with this one, it's one of the rare whiskies from Laphroaig where they actually guarantee that it's non-chill filtered. It's on the back label there. Give you a little close-up so you can see that. So there's all that blurb, and then at the bottom it says non-chill filtered, which is great. It's absolutely incredible that Laphroaig have, for a very rare occurrence, told us that one of their whiskies is non-chill filtered. Sometimes they tell us, sometimes they don't, sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. But why is it like that? Why do we have to live in this constant doubt? Why do they tell us that this one is non-chill filtered, and then sometimes there's others that are, but they don't tell us, but then they tell us verbally? Why can't it just be on the label? They're obviously playing some sort of strategic game of chess with their labels here, where they're trying to do God knows what. But there must be a reason why sometimes they tell us and sometimes they don't. And it's not as simple as if it's not on the label, then it doesn't apply. Because there have been Laphroaig expressions in the past which they've said are non-chill filtered, and it doesn't say it on the label. Interested to know what you think about that one, if you've got any theories on why they sometimes give us the info and sometimes they don't. Let me know what you think. As for the price of this one, it's actually another rare whiskey, because this is a whiskey which actually went down in price. When this was introduced, I can't remember how much it was. I tried it as a sample, and I think it sold for, I think, about 80, 85 pounds. And I thought that that was far too much based on what I tasted from that sample. And I didn't buy a bottle back in the early days. In my opinion, I think that Laphroaig released this, and it was obviously to fill the gap left by the 15 and the 18. They wanted to make a more premium Laphroaig, but they wanted to make it without actually using older stock. And I think that they released this, and from what I remember, it is fairly poorly received. A lot of people thought the same as me, that it was overpriced and it probably didn't sell that well. And I think it's probably that initial poor reception that led to the price of this coming down. It also kind of shows you how kind of preconceptions and opinions and perspective on whiskey has changed over the last few years. I think that when this first appeared, a lot of people rejected it because it's a no-age statement whiskey, and for me at least, I thought that it didn't hold up to the old 18 that had just been discontinued. Now, compared to the new 18-year-old, which is selling for £180 a bottle, it's becoming one of the more value premium offerings from Laphroaig. I think that this whiskey is also a strong sign of the times, that it's got such a busy, convoluted, and frankly over-the-top cask recipe that there's so much going on there, so many different casks in the vatting, and it's so cask heavy, which in my opinion is a very, very modern thing. But I think that to some people, that cask heavy recipe may make it a little bit more interesting than the 16-year-old, especially if you're the kind of person that has a preference of cask over spirit. So that's enough of that. Let's get some in the glass and see what Laphroaig Lore is all about. Interesting choice of name, I think. Calling it Laphroaig Lore, you are very much implying that it is a traditional whiskey, it's old style, it's how they used to make them back in the day. But it's also a very, very, very modern thing to have virgin oak and quarter casks and this wildly differing age statement components in a whiskey. Kind of very modern, dressed up as traditional. And I also think that's, apart from things like the PX cask and a couple of other special releases, I think that's probably one of the darkest Laphroaigs I've ever seen. On the nose, I think that it is pretty close to the 10-year-old, but with the benefit of that added 48% ABV. It really, this sounds a bit odd, but it reminds me of like what you would get if you got Laphroaig 10-year-old and mixed it with like a high proof navy rum, because it's got a real thick, sugary, casky, oaky profile, as well as like notes of Laphroaig 10. It's like if Laphroaig made a navy rum. Lots of sugariness, sugary oak, warm vanilla peat, raw and oaky, big oakiness on this one. And also a similar sappy green oak, sugary fresh oak as what I was getting on the new 18. Charred oak, possibly some freshly charred casks there, which is probably the quarter casks and possibly the virgin oak as well. Definitely a note of barrel char in this one, as well as sawdust. A little bit of a note of French polish, and lots of oak spice and hamster cage and musty, dusty oakiness. There is a strong peatiness in this whiskey, but it's perhaps a subdued peatiness to what you would expect from a youngish Laphroaig. Getting a little bit of TCP, almond. Again, that dark Demerara navy rum note. Dark fruits, slightly winey on the nose, like sherry and almost a red wine wininess, which as far as we know isn't in this, but it's got that dark fruitiness. I think it's also got that slight minerality and slight chalkiness that you get on some red wine casks, despite, as I said before, we're not actually told that there is red wine in this. I think that's probably coming through from the sherry cask, but it's got that mineral, chalky, dark fruits note, for me at least. And I think it's that fruit and possibly the heavy oaky cask side of this that really subdues that smoke, which probably is there, but it's just hidden under 1,000,001 other things. Cherry menthol throat lozenges. Salty, it's quite maritime, salty oak, sea foam, seashores, which you maritime malt mates will know is the proper term for that. The smell of the seashore is dimethyl sulfide. Caramel, mint and clove, quite planky. The oak on this one really feels, and it's quite a direct in-your-face oakiness. Oaky and planky. Little note of firelighters, like paraffin firelighters, slight petrochemical note. A little bit of raisin. Background Oloroso and burnt oak. So it's an interesting nose. It's a featureful nose. It's got a lot of flavours, but my god is it busy. There's a lot of things going on in this one, as you'd expect from the cask recipe. They don't all they don't all sit happily together and pull in the same direction. There is a lot going on, and I think that you can tell that it's a mixed maturation and it's a complicated vatting. I think that it really shows. Laphroaig Law, let's see how it tastes. Very sweet, very oaky, very bourbonised Islay. And when I say bourbonised, I mean it's got a real oak spice and a real strong sweetness to it. Again, more of that dark navy rum demerara note, lots of caramel, lots of vanilla, peated sugary grist, sugary raw oakiness. I think that it gets a little bit dirtier with time. Some of the more phenolic notes start to come out the more time you spend with it. Again, it's got that mineral and medicinal side, but always very sweet and very rounded. And I think that's probably coming through from the amount of raw oak that we've got in this. It's just pulling a lot of sweetness and vanillin and kind of like oak sugariness from all of that raw oak. Very vanilla heavy, spicy, salty oakiness. And yes, slightly planky sawdust and raw wood in the mix there as well. I think that the sherry is noticeable on this one. I don't think that it's anywhere near as noticeable as what you used to get in the triple wood, which I really miss. I thought that Laphroaig triple wood was probably one of the best non-age statement Laphroaigs of all time. I think that with this one you're getting a little bit of bitter cocoa, some dark fruits, a little bit of kind of like a resinous, winey, mixed with paraffin note. It definitely seems like a young and boisterous whiskey to me. Sweet medicinal sherry, as well as quite a strong, what I'm detecting as like quite a strong burnt almond oil note, which is probably about the only clue to me that there's any old stock in this. I don't think that this tastes like an old whiskey. It doesn't really even taste like there's a noticeable portion of old stock in the vatting. I do think that this is a slightly disjointed mix of old malt, young oak, and sherry, and raw oak, and just so many other things. It's really a little bit hard to keep track of. And you do wonder if part of the design brief of this one was that it's designed to confuse. Because when you're trying to make a no age statement whiskey to replace age statements, that's kind of the aim. That's the name of the game, isn't it? To confuse, to pull the wool over. Whether you think it's a good thing or not, when you're making a no age statement whiskey to replace aged stuff, you are engaging in a little bit of deception. Is that bad? I don't know. If the people that buy it still think that it's good or better, possibly, then that's fine. Maybe bad, maybe not, but fool me once and all that. You know how it goes. Let's have one more sip and look at the finish. Actually, a good long finish. Finish really does stay with you for quite a long time. Really long finish, lots of oak spice and sea salt, peppery oak, freshly sawn oak, a little bit of dark fruit and cherry and like licorice root, and a good medicinal quality like a TCP and peated grist quality throughout. Really good long finish. Saying that, it is a very, very modern, oaky and raw oaky note throughout the experience, but especially on the finish. But that finish does go on and on, much like my reviews. I think that the flavours that you get in this, they are a little bit muddled. It is a convoluted whiskey with flavours coming from every direction. And I think that the flavours that you get as an end result from this are a little bit muddled and a little bit over blended and a little bit too complicated, I think. And I think that because of that, I think that it comes off as a little bit simple and a little bit subdued compared to things like the only slightly more expensive but significantly older Laphroaig 16. And for that reason, probably, I think that this one, especially when you're drinking it in a comparison to one of those other 48% Laphroaigs, it doesn't always feel the full 48%. I think that it's maybe losing a little bit of that power to the busyness of the cask recipe. And as I said before, it also, to me, does not seem like a 15-year-old whiskey. I think, obviously, John Campbell wasn't lying. That cask breakdown with all the 15-year-old components and the 21, it applied to one vatting, but I struggle to believe that it applies to this batch. To my tastes, it definitely seems to me like there's a sizable percentage of young stuff in this, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. Although I can't help but feel that you could probably recreate this style of whiskey with a good measure of the 10 cask strength and either a bit of the triple wood or the 10 sherry, or even a drop of sherry itself into the 10 cask strength and a bunch of water. I do not think that you're getting old Laphroaig for cheap with this one, which I can't help but feel is what they wanted us to think when they released this. As for that convoluted, very complicated cask breakdown, I think that there is definitely evidence of the Oloroso and the Virgin Oak and the quarter casks as well, and I don't think that it's an utter disaster. I'll make no secret that those, especially quarter casks and Virgin Oak, are not my style of whiskey, they're not my cup of tea, but I don't mind the Oloroso, but I think it's all going to depend on your opinion of raw oak and whiskey, and the combination of peat and sherry is not for everyone. Some people love it, some don't. And even for people that do like that combination of peat and sherry, it's not the easiest thing to do. I think that it works quite well in this, but your miles may vary. It does actually at times, this Laphroaig lore, it does occasionally remind me of the old triple wood, which I sadly think has been discontinued now. And it reminds me of triple wood in a good way because I really loved that expression. I'm not always that convinced about the heavy oak influence in this one though. Yes, I think it's partially balanced by other things, but when the oak shows, I think this is probably even more heavily oaked than Laphroaig quarter cask. And I am really not a fan of planky raw oak, engineered oak style whiskey. And I do wonder at times if the reason why they put those quarter casks in this was a way of offloading some over oaked casks. In the early days of Laphroaig quarter cask, Laphroaig themselves said that a full term maturation in quarter casks is too much. It's too much oak for a palatable whiskey. Yet, if you believe what John Campbell said, full term maturation in quarter casks is exactly what they've done with one of the components in this. And we do have to talk about that cask breakdown and the fact that we were told the cask breakdown for a batch of Laphroaig Law, or at least one bottle of one batch of Laphroaig Law was that cask breakdown. Is this bottle that I've got here the same cask breakdown? Unless Laphroaig are going to tell me, unless they're going to take my batch number and get back to me and tell me what the cask breakdown was for this batch, we're never going to know. And frankly, we shouldn't have to ask. We should be told. But also bearing in mind that the SWA, the Scotch Whisky Association, don't let distilleries be totally transparent about vatting recipes when it comes to age, you do have to think that it's kind of a clever little trick. It's a wise decision to leak the details of batch 1 and then change it to something else and let everyone continue to assume that it's the same recipe for future batches. The truth is, without inside information from Laphroaig, which we're unlikely to get, we don't know. And thanks to the SWA, we're not allowed to know. Either way, though, I don't think that anyone should buy Laphroaig Law expecting an old Laphroaig experience. And I don't think anyone should be fooled into thinking that they're buying a vatting of 15 and 21-year-old Laphroaig when they buy this. That's just not what it seems to me. I think that the average age of what I'm tasting with this seems to be around 8 to 10 years old. And the problem with these multi-age vattings that many distilleries want us to buy instead of the discontinued age statements is that you rarely, very, very rarely manage to pad out old stock. Yes, top dressing exists, but that really improves a younger whiskey. It doesn't take a young whiskey and turn it into a vatting that tastes like older stuff. Instead, you end up with something that tastes young and old at the same time, to varying degrees of success. Saying that, I do think that this is good whiskey, despite not being the old 15 or the 18. It is a very, very modern style of whiskey that has a lot of different flavours in it. But I think that if you're open to that, if you're open to trying that experience, then this may be a good one. And at the more recent lower prices of around 60, maybe £65, considering the non-chill filtered and 48% presentation, it can actually be a good buy. The only question for me on this one is that for around that price, do you want the extra sherry of the Laphroaig 10 sherry oak, or the triple wood if you can still find it, or the extra intensity of the 10 cask strength? To me, this is kind of a middle ground that will please some, but I think that with the Laphroaig core range lineup, you always have other very, very strong options. I think that when you're comparing this to other Laphroaigs, it is kind of the unloved middle child of the Laphroaig range, that it's supposedly got some old stock in there, but it's not old, it's also not young, it's not the most peated, it's not the most sherried. What is it? What does Laphroaig Law offer you above all of the other expressions? The only thing that I can really say is that it is a more casky whiskey. It is full of cask influence and lots of virgin oak, oak spice, lots of sherry, as well as retaining some of the peat, some of the bourbon. If that kind of thing appeals to you, if that is your jam, then yeah, by all means. I do think that this is a great mixed maturation, if that's your kind of thing. I think that the closest thing to this in the Laphroaig lineup is probably the quarter cask. To be more specific, I think that Laphroaig Law is really a fruity Laphroaig quarter cask. But if raw oak and oak spice and cask influence is what you're looking for in a Laphroaig, I would probably just save a little bit of money and go for the quarter cask. If you want extra age, which I don't think this really has, I would say go for the 16. If you want sherry, go for the 10-year-old sherry cask or the superb triple wood if you can still find it. And I think that if you want a heavily peated Laphroaig, probably go for anything else, preferably the 10 cask strength. I think that this Laphroaig lore, it's really a true jack of all trades, that it has a little bit of everything, but in my opinion, it's a little bit muddled, and generally, whatever you're looking for, something else in the core range does it better. And in my opinion, that makes it a little bit like Ardbeg Ano, which I think is another whiskey which is really good if you view it in isolation, but when you compare it to the rest of the Ardbeg core range, you can always find something that does what you're looking for a little bit better, and it just makes you wonder why it exists. Saying that, I do like this one. It's got some interesting flavours. It is very heavy on the oak for me, which is not something that I like. That's just my personal preference. Good amount of peat, lots and lots of oak, little bit of sherry. It's Laphroaig lore. There you go. Review in 10 seconds. I have been enjoying this one though, and I think it's a good one to share with other people because it's an interesting whiskey. It's different. I like it. I think that many will love it, but for me, the premium Laphroaig will always be the 10 cask strength or possibly the 16. Let me know what you think about this one because I think it's going to be a divisive one. I think it's a good whiskey, but I think that it is also a little bit of a Frankenstein. Let me know if you agree, disagree, indifferent, or has the price of this and the lack of age statement just put you off entirely? Let me know your thoughts. Thanks for watching and cheers.